Hello and welcome to the Voice of Iron. And in this battle rant, I want to answer a question that I was recently asked about Battletech as a setting, or Mechwarrior as a setting. How does communication work? As many of you who play Battletech will know, the inner sphere, the primary part of the galaxy where Battletech takes place, is about 1,000 light years across. Give or take. It's not necessarily adding the periphery, and it's definitely, larger as a setting thanks to things like clan space and the deep periphery, all that stuff. But that begs the question, how do you communicate faster than light at those sorts of distances? And so I decided to sit down, pour up some coffee, do a little bit of digging on Sarna, and, just look through the lore in general, read up and figure out, okay, well, how do people communicate? I always knew that Comstar was involved, and I'd heard of the HPG network before, but what surprised me was not only kind of how it works, but that HPGs aren't the only way to communicate faster than light. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So for this battle rant, I'm going to go over the primary forms of communication that exist in the inner sphere. And just a disclaimer, I might miss something. This is not a lore reading. This is unscripted, so if I miss something, just let me know in the comments. But generally speaking, this is what I've come to understand about faster-than-light communication in Battletech/Mechwarrior. So, first and foremost, how it all began. It all began pretty mundanely. Just a quick thing, I mentioned how FTL works in a previous rant, but in short, Doctors Kearney and Fushida, back in the actual 2020s, I believe in 2019 originally, but they published papers as late as 2022 according to the setting, and probably later, to be honest. They discovered that there was a concept that allowed for information or matter to jump between star systems. Roughly about 30 light years if you're transferring tons, but one of their papers indicated that you could go further than that, but with small amounts of information, maybe about 50 light years. Anyway, in the 2100s, humanity used this concept to create the first jump ship when they jumped a vessel from the Sol system all the way to, I believe, Alpha Centauri. Now, there's a reason I'm retreading ground. Back in those days, the fastest way to communicate faster than light was literally just to take a communication with you. Rather than trying to beam information from, say, Earth to a new colony in Alpha Centauri, they would download that information or hand off that information to whoever was going on the jump ship, jump to Alpha Centauri, and then send the information from there. It kind of is self-explanatory at that point. You literally had ships just take the information with them. And as humanity expanded through the stars, this was kind of how it worked. Now, this was slow, all things considered. It was about as slow as actual jumping was. But, all things considered, with most colonies being set up, taking about a week to get messages back from home, that didn't cause too much problems, at least until humanity really got further out there. Then suddenly it could be weeks or even a month delay to getting critical information, and suddenly Earth was ruling people that, they had like a month-long delay or more between finding out what was going on out there. It led to some problems. I'm sure I'll go over that at some point when I talk about the Terran hegemony versus the Terran alliance and the Great Houses and all that stuff, but suffice it to say, it was pretty slow. But that said, even as politics changed and got things together, people still primarily used this. There really wasn't a better option for hundreds of years. You send the information onto a dropship, go to your jump ship, jump to the next system, and pass on that information. There did come to be a term, it is referred to in the setting as Pony Express, which takes its name from the actual real-life Pony Express concept, where basically a jump ship would jump to one system and then pass off its dropships or cargo or information to another waiting jump ship that was there, which could then take it off. That way you didn't have to wait a week to jump from one system to the next, and it could pretty quickly get information reliably multiple systems away within about a week or so, given how many jump ships there were prepared in such a chain. And, of course, with larger governments, and especially early Star League needing to communicate those large distances, they would set up these so-called Pony Express chains of jump ships just waiting at stars ready to get their information, or get the drop ships and cargo, and then pass it off. That was, at least, until the early 2600s, when the First Lord of the brand new Star League realized that there needed to be a way to communicate far faster and far cheaper than just chaining up ships. While they did play with a couple of different methods, one of which we'll talk about later, the one that ended up winning out was what came to be known as a hyperpulse. Basically, Doctors Kearney and Fushida, who I mentioned earlier, had proposed the idea of making artificial jump points. Regular FTL requires kind of finding a natural jump point, usually, directly above or below a star or towards the edge of a system. Those are usually the most stable places. But in short, they also came up with this concept where you could technically make your own stable jump point. Turns out they were right, but the energy cost was insane, to the point of just being prohibitively insane. Yes, we can do that. However, we'd have to use the power of, the star system itself to make one in order to jump ships. However, the scientists in the Terran hegemony, and of course the brand new Star League, thought, well, hold on a minute. We might not be able to make an artificial jump point long enough or big enough to handle, a ship, but if we can open it for a couple of milliseconds, we could beam some data through. And so, the hyperpulse generator was designed, and it took about, 15 years or so for them to finish developing this thing, but the first hyperpulse generator came online and successfully transmitted a message New Year's Day, 2630. And so it was that hyperpulse generators became the new normal for interstellar communication. Now, someone within 50 light years, because, it had a longer range, you didn't have to do tons and tons of cargo like a jump ship, could be sent out on an almost daily basis. No need to wait for things to recharge. It still took a lot of energy, but no need to wait for it. No need to send an entire ship or wait for the drop ship to fly all the way to wherever the jump ship is waiting and then fly all the way to the destination planet. Suddenly you could just send packets of information almost instantaneously, 1.2 seconds, I think is the actual delay, for 50 light years at a time, and then that gets relayed further and further. Suddenly, you could communicate almost instantly with people across the inner sphere. I believe the example that was given in Sarna, back when I was reading it, was you could get a message from Earth to Tharkad, the capital of the Lyran Commonwealth, so pretty far away. I believe the time difference for a non-priority message was a little under a week, which automatically is going to be faster than that sort of Pony Express system using jump ships. Or a priority message could be sent in less than a day. And you might be asking, well, what's the difference? Well, because these hyperpulse generators did take energy to fire, they would usually fire them at regular intervals and send a bunch of people's messages all at once. So for instance, let's say that you want to send a text message saying hi to someone who lives in the Draconis Combine, and you live on Earth. Well, your text message is going to be bundled with the 500 other messages that other people within the last hour or so wanted to send, and then boom, one big pulse gets sent out there. I believe by the way, it's split into two circuits. There's the first circuit, which sends messages, at least during the Star League, about once every 6 hours or so, and then the second circuit, or the Class B circuit, whatever it may be called, which is other HPGs which send out information either once or twice a day, depending. Of course, after the fall of the Star League, that stuff could take as long as a week to fire off because they want to save power and all that stuff. But anyway, a priority message, they'll just fire it immediately, but it's stupid expensive. So usually that's saved for hey, I'm the prince and I need to send this information to that other duke way on the distant territory right now or he's gonna die. That might have a priority message. It costs thousands. By the way, I might have to talk about currency in this setting at some point, but I found out that Comstar, the people who basically have a monopoly on the hyperpulse generators, base their currency on transmission. So one C-bill, like one sort of dollar-style equivalent, is equivalent to transmitting 1 millisecond of data via the hyperpulse generator. So keeping the pulse open for 1 millisecond costs 1 C-bill, which honestly makes it an incredibly stable currency, but I can get into that in detail later. In short, this entire system, right, was set up, and now people in the Terran hegemony, and of course now the Greater Star League, can communicate with each other almost instantly. This system that was set up ended up coming under the control primarily of SL Comnet, the Star League Communications Network. And it went pretty well until the Star League fell apart. This unseemly gentleman by the name of Stefan Amaris decided to take over the Star League in something that could be its own 2-hour rant. But in short, he really messed up everything. And SL Comnet started breaking down. But one of their last acts was to appoint a man by the name of Jerome Blake to the post of kind of the head of the Comnet. And he realized, okay, well, Star League's fallen apart, everything's fallen apart, and I don't even know if the hegemony is going to live. So he very quickly consolidated power and set up Comstar, which was a corporation that was designed to maintain control of the HPG network. And they basically got a monopoly by looking at the Great Houses and saying, listen, if you declare us neutral, we declare you neutral. Also, I own the Earth now, which is its own little gambit that he played. But in short, it worked. I mean, the threat of suddenly having to go back to Pony Express for all of the Great Houses, it was too much. So they agreed to his terms, I assume on a temporary basis, but here's the thing. He got a firm grip on all those HPGs before he made that ultimatum. He didn't really let anyone else in to reverse engineer or try and make their own, and his team made a very, very concerted effort to make sure that no one else was making their own. Now, he himself seemed pretty pragmatic, but his successor, Conrad Toyama, kind of made it worse by not only ensuring that no one else could make their own HPGs, but couching the whole order in a pseudo-religious sense. So, in short, Comstar controlled the HPG networks in the Inner Sphere for the longest time. Now, the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because it is relevant to the third type of faster-than-light communications that exists in this setting, because there is a third type that is neither the Pony Express nor the HPG network. Now, it is technically based on the same principles. Drs. Kearney and Fushida came up with these ideas because the Kearney-Fushida drive and the hyperpulse generator both rely on a concept of subspace, a sort of dimension just below space. There was a third way to use subspace, unlike the hyperpulse generator, which opened a small jump point to send things through, and of course Pony Express, which allowed ships to jump through themselves. There was research into something known as Project Transient. Funny enough, the Star League started working on this before the hyperpulse generator ended up proving itself to be more efficient, and it was more efficient. HPGs were nearly instantaneous, whereas this system took time. The way that a black box works is, unlike the hyperpulse generator, which sends a instant package of information through a little jump point tunnel to another receiver, instead the black box kind of sends a ripple through subspace. In other words, it broadcasts a message that goes outward on a certain, you could call it a frequency, and that disseminates and could be received by another black box. Now, this could only have about, I think it was like 2 kilobytes of information at the time, which was less than an HPG. It was slower than an HPG, and the earliest devices only had about a 150 light-year range total, which meant that unless you wanted to relay with another black box and again take even more time to communicate, the HPG was just better. Plus, the Star League theorized that it might eventually interfere with other Kearney-Fushida principal equipment such as HPGs or jump ships, so they kind of abandoned it. That is, until it was picked back up around the 3000s. Archon Katrina Steiner of the Lyran Commonwealth ended up getting her hands on a black box, as it would come to be known, and this Project Transient research ended up coming into an alternative to using the HPG network. She, along with Prince Davian of the Federated Suns and the New Avalon Institute of Science in Federated Suns Davian territory, kind of reverse engineered it and realized, no, we can make this work, and it didn't seem to actually interfere with jump ships or HPGs like the Star League was worried about. So they started manufacturing these for secret communications. That way Comstar couldn't interfere with anything, and of course their enemies wouldn't have any possible way of knowing that they're communicating. Now eventually the Caretans ended up getting their hands on some and making their own, and by the time of the clan invasion it kind of became widely known that, yep, there's another way that people are communicating, and these were used. So it started becoming more of just kind of an alternate way to communicate, but it really wasn't widely disseminated. It was mostly just used as a military asset because these things could be tiny. I didn't mention this, but hyperpulse generators are multiple tons. The smallest HPG system is at minimum 12 tons, and that was with advanced Star League technology. Your typical mobile one, quote-unquote, is about 50 tons, and that can be installed in starships, and your average is the size of a building and is a permanent installation. Meanwhile, a black box, these Project Transient research devices that ended up getting used by the Federated Commonwealth, that ended up being roughly the size of a briefcase, and very easy to port around. But again, much slower, much less information. They eventually were able to get more information going and even had more channels. Imagine kind of broadcasting on different frequencies. But ultimately, it was just inferior to the hyperpulse generator. And they didn't receive wide use until the word of Blake basically made the HPG network unusable for a while, or rather, whatever caused the Grey Monday blackout event in the 3100s. That's its own topic. It's a controversial topic in Battletech. Suffice it to say, black box technology finally got its day in the sun when HPGs were effectively useless because most of them got destroyed or at the very least rendered inoperable for some time. They started rebuilding them eventually, but turns out the downside of the black boxes were when every planet was using them regularly, they did interfere with each other. At least somewhat, to the point where their messages kept garbling each other and they became unreliable. Oops, I guess the Star League might have actually been onto something. But, in short, just to kind of summarize all that we've gone through so far, there are 3 ways to communicate faster than light in Battletech. The first and foremost is the Pony Express, literally taking information manually on a dropship and then taking it to a jump ship and jumping to another system, preferably getting onto a different jump ship which is already charged, and then jumping to your destination in that sort of chain. The second way, which turned out to be far more efficient and is still seen as the standard in the setting for pretty much every era past the Star League, and even during the Star League, is the Hyperpulse Generator, which also for most of its life was under a complete monopoly of Comstar, the pseudo-religious mega-corporation that controlled all of them. And then, finally, the Black Box, also known as Project Transient back in the days of the Star League, which, although initially abandoned, turned out to be very useful if you ever wanted to circumvent Comstar and its monopoly, but ultimately was just not nearly as efficient, couldn't stack up, and eventually turned out to kind of cause problems with itself due to overuse. Now, in terms of these as plot devices, the setting actually handles them very, very well. I mean, the Pony Express idea is, pretty straightforward. I'm not gonna lie, the fact that early interstellar communication literally required you to jump the info with you feels pretty hard sci-fi. It feels pretty realistic. They treat it with the sort of gravity that would be necessary. Yeah, communications across stellar distances are hard. And the fact that eventually they solved it with hyperpulse generators, which again themselves are massive machines, The tiniest little receiver is still 12 tons. With the best of technology, I mean, that's pretty good. And I like the way that they handled it as a plot device, and the black box doesn't break the internal consistency of the universe while still giving a nice alternative and explaining why other people didn't use it. It's just not that efficient, it's just not that good of a communications device, and it has its own problems with overuse. Basically, they being the writers, really thought of, kind of, what are the consequences of all of these things? I've heard criticisms, of course, that, Comstar has way too much plot armor and other people should have hyperpulse generators, and to that, I say the clans showed that you don't need Comstar to have this, and whether or not Comstar truly has plot armor or just sufficient numbers and technology to maintain their monopoly in the Inner Sphere is really up to which writers you like and what parts of the setting you tend to prefer. But, again, just to kind of summarize it all of these use in some way the fictional Kearney-Fushida principle, which allows for jumping or sending information through subspace very rapidly. And I think that's pretty cool. This has become a slightly longer battle rant than usual, but yeah, in short, faster than light communications in Battletech uses either hyperpulse generators, jump ships literally carrying the information, or a secret third thing, which we will use as a tool later, the black boxes, which are okay. And yeah, all of these use subspace or the Kearney-Fushida principle to some degree, and I think that's just about it. Anyway, thank you very much for listening all the way through this battle rant. I hope it was informative and entertaining about a little piece of Battletech lore. And again, this was unscripted, and I probably made a couple of errors because I'm not one of the writers of the actual setting. So, I'm sure I missed something. But either way, thank you for listening, and as always, thank you for listening to my voice.